This is part 5 in my series of presentations on defending Australia. It is largely in response to comments on my previous description of the impact of the Defence Strategic Review on the Australian Army. Is it being gutted? What do I mean by that? In this video, I try to explain my reasoning. Equally, while I try to keep it as factual as possible, I admit it remains highly subjective. Please note that this is a replacement for the original presentation that had a serious error in it. The theme for the discussion and my conclusions remain unchanged. Before continuing, there is an apology I would like to make with regards to the original presentation. There was a serious error in that presentation in a discussion on the rotation system and in my applying it to the Timor deployment. It was caused by sloppiness in presentation and argument, not intent or even lack of knowledge. I have tried briefly to present the argument better in this presentation. However, I did not want the brief narrative I provided on Timor to disappear, so I have stripped it into its own presentation without any reference to this series on defending Australia. The purpose of all my presentations is to generate discussion on Australian strategic policy. I firmly believe that the failure of over 200 federal MPs and senators, as well as the Defence Department, to attempt to engage all Australians in the understanding how we defend Australia is a serious mistake. In the process, I will unfortunately make mistakes in these presentations. Generally, I will just wear them, and I actually think it is an excellent outcome to have my views challenged and different data presented in the comments. On this occasion, as I have said, there was I made a mistake, and there was a comment lodged that made me realise that in the old presentation, my mistake had sent the debate off in the wrong direction. I hope this presentation, this replacement, will refocus the discussion on the main purpose of these presentations rather than on that error. The Army in 2023, how did we get there? And what do I mean by the rotation system? In 1997, the Australian Army was primarily structured for a last-ditch defence of continental Australia. It had one primary combat brigade supported by 2 weak light infantry brigades. That year, the Howard government basically told the Army to be ready to conduct independently overseas deployment, and one brigade was always to be made available. This put the Army into complete turmoil. You simply cannot send overseas the only major combat brigade available for the defence of Australia. 2 years later, the Army was also again instructed to increase the readiness of the 1st Brigade and to expand the strength of the 3rd Brigade. An immediate problem to overcome was how a small professional army could maintain an overseas force for an unknown length of time in unknown circumstances while experiencing an unknown number of casualties. Just 7 months later, it happened. 3rd Brigade was sent to Timor for the largest overseas operation by the Australian Army since Vietnam. It was soon followed by major open-ended deployments to the Middle East. In a quarter of a century from 1997, the current rotation system came into existence. It started with the identification that a rotation system was needed, followed by the beginnings of a rotation system, a forced implementation under the then existing structure, ad hoc arrangements to make it work, formalization of a rotation system, and finally the Army structure that existed in 2023. Let's start with some simple statistics. Since the Australian intervention in Timor in September 1999, the Australian Army has made the equivalent of roughly 20 battalion-sized deployments to places such as Timor, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Solomon Islands. Note that I've ignored small detachments and counted reinforced companies as a quarter of a battalion. This equates to about 1 battalion equivalent a year. Out of these operations, and under governments of both sides, a new structure for the Australian Army was developed based around a rotation system. Please note that I am leaving the Special Forces out of this discussion. However, their deployments were at a much higher rate than the RAR battalions, and almost certainly that tempo will continue, perhaps even increase dramatically. Their super soldier status that justifies these deployments stems from political ignorance and risk avoidance that leads to their overuse. That overuse comes with its own cost to Australia's Special Forces. That prolonged 25-year development led to the creation of a rotation system. It was based around 3 identical combined arms brigades. The brigades rotated yearly between 3 states: rebuilding, preparing for deployment, then ready and available for deployment. The first year was spent getting new recruits into their battalions. Many, if not all, of their NCOs came from the same battalion after being promoted on merit. The NCOs knew and trusted each other. The new recruits would learn to do the same. Then they spent another year training together and preparing for any deployment as a brigade. In any deployment, the members of the battalions had spent at least 2 years together. What this means is that if Australia ever needed to deploy forces overseas, we always had one brigade ready to go. It could either go on a new deployment, or if there was an extended existing deployment, it could replace the brigade that was already overseas. The pressure on the families was much reduced by having this rotation system. Now, in 2023, on the eve of Anzac Day, this very rotation system that had taken a quarter of a century to develop was destroyed with a stroke of a pen. The new structure has a so-called 1st Brigade, but it actually only has 1 battalion. We now have 3rd Brigade with most, if not all, of the main battle tanks and the new Redback infantry fighting vehicles. And then there's the 7th Brigade acting as a motorised brigade with no or very little heavy equipment. Now, if you think about it, when you're looking at overseas deployments, no one is going to send the infantry battalions from the Army's primary combat unit, 3rd Brigade, and leave Australia virtually defenceless. That leaves the other 4 infantry battalions lacking infantry fighting vehicles for overseas deployments. Okay, a supporter of the DSR may admit there's a few problems here, but so what? We still have the battalions to deploy if needed. Now, let's stop looking at the battalion deployments here. Let's look at what this structure means for the readiness without any rotation system. 3rd Brigade is our sole combat brigade. It is the only Army unit capable of handling any serious military threat to Australia that sees boots on the ground. And by saying this, I don't mean any disrespect to the other battalions. As I said before, they simply lack the equipment to go toe-to-toe with any moderately equipped opponent. Therefore, inevitably, 3rd Brigade must be kept ready to deploy for a fight. It will, by necessity, have first call on recruits to maintain its numbers, equipment to maintain its combat strength, and training to ensure its readiness. Therefore, the other 4 battalions will always be in this hybrid state, combining the old rebuilding, preparing for deployment phases. NCOs and officers will see a constant turnover of personnel, a reduced level of training at the battalion level, especially if funds are reduced, even if just by inflation, combined with the need to deploy at short notice with increased deployment times. Again, so what? We'll have missiles. Okay. Allow me to provide a visual example of what I mean. Before the DSR, this rotation system meant that any shortfall in recruitment didn't really matter, as the brigades rotated through their readiness status. The brigade ready to deploy started the year at full strength and with all its equipment. The rebuilding brigade received the new recruits. However, as I've noted under the new structure, 3rd Brigade must always be maintained at full strength. Shortfalls in recruitment will hit the other battalions first. The forecast for the ADF is that it is going to be about 6% under strength. This would equate to a permanent shortfall in the 4 battalions most likely to do any overseas deployment of over 10%. We already know that one of the government's responses to the DSR is to dramatically reduce the number of the new Redbacks, or infantry fighting vehicles. This is quite a serious reduction. If the old structure was retained and the full complement of the new infantry fighting vehicles and mobile artillery was provided, Australia could, in a crisis, be able to equip a modern mechanised infantry division fleshed out by volunteers or called up reservists, though they will obviously need training. Under the new structure, the Australian Army will never have more than 1 mechanised infantry brigade. General Molan, in his book, called the Australian Army, of which he was so justly proud, a one-shot wonder. It is now 1/3 of the strength it was when he made that statement. However, regardless of the number of volunteers who answer the call, they will have a rifle, hopefully. It was a long and arduous path to create a highly flexible army that, for its size, was astonishingly able to deploy overseas every year a different but highly trained and cohesive combined arms brigade at full strength. Although that army may have lacked depth and would prove itself unable to sustain itself in any high-intensity combat, its ability in any prolonged crisis to field an entire fully equipped mechanized division was also quite remarkable given its size. If you are a one-shot wonder, make it a good shot. Now that we've got the DSR structure implemented, should any future government again change the role of the Army, and let's face it, they will, and that is combined with a return to an increased tempo of operations, then we will again have to have an army that is simply not fit for purpose. It is simply unacceptable that the DSR will have destroyed a structure that took 25 years to develop and may well take 25 years to rebuild. The absence of the rotation system will again prove extraordinary, with Australians facing burnout and even psychological injuries from excessive tours. And that cost will fall on an ever-decreasing body of Australians willing to carry that burden. In the end, whether you agree with it or not, this is a discussion that needs to be had.